Hey everyone, this is Dr. Jacobs again. This week we're going to dive into some of the main developmental theories that we'll be learning about across the semester. So let's go ahead and get started. This week, there's some things that I want you to be able to do by the end of the unit. I want you to be able to identify and provide a brief description of the common developmental theories. For example, cognitive development, psychosocial stages, social learning theory, behaviorism. There's a lot more than that. Those are just some examples of what we'll be learning about. I want you to be able to explain what a stage theorist thinks about how development occurs. Identify the major theorists and their respective theories. I also want you to be able to explain how systems impact development through utilizing Brofenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as developmental systems theory as well. I also want you to be able to explain the concept of zeitgeist and how it impacts development. And then I want you also to be able to define important theory terminology. So to start off with, we're going to start learning about something called psychodynamic theory. And by the picture here, you might guess who the main theorist for this is. Sometimes we hear psychodynamic theory, also called psychoanalytic. Sometimes people use those interchangeably. And of course, our major theorist for this is going to be Sigmund Freud. If we were going to try to boil this theory down into a sentence, and there's a lot that goes along with this theory, we would want to basically say that childhood experiences influence the rest of development. And that's pretty tame, actually. So if you know a lot about Freud, there is some risque things that comes from his beliefs about how the world operates and people's main motivations. But if we're really trying to look at the crux of what his theory is saying, is that maybe some of these childhood experiences that we have influence how we are as adults. So Freud has two major different areas that we could talk about. We could talk about Freud and personality. We can also talk about Freud's psychosexual stages, which we'll get to next. And so personality, sometimes people define personality as the self or the essence of a human. Other people define personality in the way that someone behaves. And so Freud, when he was looking at personality, he believed there were three different parts. There's the id, the ego, and the superego. So as a child, Freud would say that the id are these, well, actually for everyone, these biological motivations or drivers for different behaviors. And so as a child, Freud would say that people mostly act in accordance with their id or these animalistic behaviors. So if you're hungry, you might cry, or if you're angry, you might just bite someone, right? You don't have anything that's going to stop you from doing that when you're first developing. As you get a little bit older through different experiences, you start to develop something called your superego. And these are kind of some of those socially desirable rules that we learn of how to act a certain way within a particular culture. And so the id and the superego often conflict with one another. And so the third part of this personality theory is that we have this ego or the self that balances out those animalistic needs versus what society expects. And so Freud would say that a healthy ego is one that can navigate these social rules while also satisfying the needs of the id. Freud was also known for the psychosexual stages, and this was super controversial for many reasons that you probably already remember from general psychology. But to start off, psychosexual stages is a stage theory. I bet you could have never guessed that. I'm being ornery. Okay. So a stage theory, basically, if you remember from the last unit, we learned about continuous versus discontinuous perspectives of how the lifespan unfolds. So with stage theories, we typically have these particular stages that we do in a certain order that's more disjointed than gradual changes. And so this is one of those stage theories. It was super controversial for several reasons. One of the main reasons is that it indicated that children have these sexual urges at very young ages, and people did not like that. Freud was from Vienna, Austria, and that was a very like a sexually repressive time period as well. And so a lot of people really didn't like that. There's a quote somewhere where it says that Freud said the motivations for life are basically work and sex. And maybe some people agree with that. And maybe other people disagree with that a little bit. But saying that children were sexual beings was very, very controversial. And so specifically, Freud focused these different stages based on these pleasure-seeking urges for various erogenous zones. So, for example, the first psychosexual stage is the oral stage. And so when someone is just born, why do you think the oral stage is the first one that Freud indicated for that age? If you said that you think it's because people are breastfeeding or bottle feeding, I guess, is another option for that. But yeah, babies have these reflexive instincts to suck on things that are put near them. They have different reflexes, like the rooting reflex, or if a baby's a cheek stroke, they'll turn their head to it. If something's put near their mouth, they're going to try to suck on it, and those are so that babies can eat and survive. And so when we look at that, we don't like to think about babies having pleasure seeking for breastfeeding. It's just something that most people don't want to think about. Freud's also known for the Oedipus complex. One of his contemporaries actually came up with the Electra complex. It's often misattributed to Freud. And so these are basically where children develop a sexual desire for their opposite sex parent and then want to compete with the same sex parent until they realize they can't. And so that was super controversial within this theory as well. So here are the different stages that we have. So there's the oral stage, 0 to 18 months. There's the anal stage from 18 to 36 months. So if you look at that, these actually do go along with some of the things that kids go through. Like, so the oral breastfeeding, yes, kids go through, they eat and, also have bottles and they have to eat through sucking. And then the anal stage goes along with toilet training and things like that. And so if you've ever heard the terms of like oral fixation, or someone calls someone, oh, that person's just anal retentive, which means that they're very like organized and do things in a particular way, sometimes very conscientious with their behavior. This all stems back to this particular theory. And so when we're looking at these things, Freud would say that if you had a parent that was super big about their kid not making messes while they're potty training, always putting them on the toilet really quickly, and not allowing them the autonomy with their own body, that they might become a very rigid adult. And so some of these things come from there. And then we see as they progress, so the Oedipal age range, or the stage for that, is mastering those competitive urges with the same-sex parent and then acquiring different gender roles. We'll also know that when we talk about these different theories, that they happen during different time periods throughout history. And so the way that people thought about the world or think about the world changes with how time evolves and what the culture of the time period is. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Then we have that latency phase where things kind of chill out a little bit with regards to these sexual urges, and a lot of the energy then is in productive task. At least that's what Freud would say. And then once puberty hits, then the stage is genital. Then maybe that's the one that he got right with this. Freud also indicated that there were some defense mechanisms that our ego could use to try to protect itself from unpleasant thoughts. One of those is denial. So this is not accepting the truth or even just lying to yourself or oneself. And so when we go through these defense mechanisms, one really way to study is to think about what kind of examples have you seen where someone was lying to themselves or not telling the truth. So for example, our materials for the book had something in there about someone not being able to admit that maybe they had a substance use problem. Specifically, I think the book mentioned an alcohol use disorder, and not accepting that if they can physically not go without drinking alcohol every day, that there might be some sort of disorder for them. Something else that you might want to think about, what are you lying to yourself about? Right. And so it's really easy for us to pick on other people for things that they're denying. But at the same time, it can be really difficult for us to evaluate ourselves and become self aware of some of these different defense mechanisms. Another one is displacement. So if you have ever worked in retail or the food service industry, I think you probably have experienced this one at some point. So displacement is when someone takes out their frustrations on a safer target. So this could be someone has a really bad day at work and they come home and take it out on their romantic partner or their children. Or conversely, if your boss makes, or let's try to think about another example with work. Yeah, if your boss makes you angry, you could take that out on other people or other workers who don't have as much power on you. If you have a professor, maybe this has happened, that has something really major going on in their life, and then they take it out on their students because they're just in a bad mood. This one's really sad. I was taught that if someone is just mean to you for no reason, a lot of times it'll stop if you just say, "Hey, is everything okay?" And almost every time, actually, I cannot think of an example where I've done that in real life and someone didn't say, "I'm sorry, it's not you. I'm taking my anger out on you, and you don't deserve that," or something like that. Maybe they don't apologize, but a lot of times people will take out their anger on someone who's safer for them to be mad at. So sometimes we see in children, if they have parents that get divorced, that they'll actually act up more with a parent that they feel safer with. And so maybe some of y'all have had that experience. Projection then is attributing unacceptable thoughts to others. So, for example, if someone's in a relationship where they've decided to exclusively be together, someone might, and they would never do this, but might accuse their partner of cheating because they are cheating. That's the most common one that I can think of offhand. Or sometimes two people will be going through the same situation, and you might have a friend that tries to advise you a certain way, but they're actually projecting their own experience and their own situation onto yours. There's also rationalization. This is by justifying behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable real reasons. For example, I went to a rougher school growing up, and I remember one of my friends saying that they stole a purse from someone because they had left, that person had left their car running with their door unlocked and the purse on their seat. And so instead of taking responsibility for their own behavior of stealing the purse, they blamed their victim for not doing something. So a lot of times we'll see that a lot with sexual assault, where people might say, "I did this because they were drunk," or "I did this because they were dressed this way," when those are not real reasons. Those are victim blaming and rationalization to protect themselves from feeling bad about the things they've done wrong. There's also reaction formation. So this is outwardly opposing something you inwardly desire, but you might find unacceptable for some reason, whether that's that you have some sort of cultural belief or a religious belief or some sort of belief that's just because of you live in either the city versus the country or something like this. So, for example, one of the biggest ones I could think of is maybe in the media where we might have someone who is a big person who's or they're very against the LGBTQIA plus community, but secretly they are watching porn with people who are LGBTQIA plus or having relationships, and they actually would be a part of the community. But instead, in public life, they are really against it. I think a couple years ago, there was something where a man went and killed, I don't remember, it was a massacre of some people who were sex workers. And even though they were having relationships with sex workers, they went and killed all of them because they opposed it, yet they were engaging in the same behavior. And so with this one, reaction formation, sometimes it's the individual trying to oppose something because they think that's the only way to combat something that they believe is unacceptable. And so this is another way that they can try to protect their ego. Another one's regression. So this would be like going back to a time when the world felt like a safer place, perhaps reverting to one's childhood behaviors, becoming more childlike in certain things. And so you'll see that paired up along a lot of times with something called repression. This is pushing painful thoughts out of the consciousness. So trying to think about something else. Sometimes when people are repressed memories, they don't remember them anymore. There's a big blank in that time frame where they don't remember exactly what happened anymore. They try to repress those thoughts out of their active mind or their consciousness. There's also sublimation, and this is also sometimes called transforming unacceptable urges into more socially acceptable behaviors. The book gave kind of a cruddy example, I thought, where they were saying a teenager decides to start being in sports and actively running to stop them from wanting to have sexual urges. I'm not sure that is something that actually happens. Maybe it does. Maybe I'm just being too hypercritical of our book. Can you all think of any good examples of sublimation? Awesome. Hopefully you shared those in our perusal document. So you'll note that I have perusal documents for this class. I'm trying to do video lectures. Sometimes I might put lectures into the actual lectures into perusal. But for now, I'm just doing this. And if you have questions or you want to discuss things, please use that perusal document so that we can learn together as a class. So then we move on to psychosocial theory. This is actually one of my favorites. The theorist for this is Erik Erikson. That's actually not his real name, his birth name. He migrated to the United States from Germany when the Nazis started taking power in Germany because he was Jewish. And so there's a whole bunch of folklore about what his real name was. There's a couple different ones, and I don't know for sure which one was his original name. But I just know that Erik Erikson's not that. He studied underneath Anna Freud. And so I thought that was kind of interesting that he followed Sigmund Freud, and then Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, continued in her father's footsteps. And then Erikson studied under Anna Freud. And if we were going to try to summarize this theory into one sentence, this would be basically saying that there are different challenges throughout life, and how you resolve them impact your development. And so we have different stages. Sometimes people get confused about what the stage is for Erikson's theory, psychosocial theory. Here you can see this graphic that I have where it has, you see the little infant, and then it says basic mistrust on the bottom and basic trust at the top. So the first Erikson stage is trust versus mistrust. Okay, and so people get kind of confused on that. This is one of those theories. It's also a stage theory that we will continue to explore throughout the semester. This one was a lot more socially acceptable to people because it had some of these more socially constructed type stages rather than sexual. So, for example, in your first year of life, you really can't do anything. And so what Erikson would say is that in our first year of life, we learn either to trust or mistrust the world based off of what interactions with people. Think about that real quick. So in the first year of life, why do we learn to trust or mistrust the world? Who do we learn that from? If you said our relationship with our caregivers, you're 100% right. And so if you have caregivers who neglect you as a child, you might learn that you can't trust people, that you have to get your needs met on your own, or it's a bad place. And so how you resolve that first stage will impact your future stages for this theory. So something that was cool that Erikson expanded his theory to go across the entire lifespan, whereas Freud only focused from birth up to adolescence. Erikson also believed in an epigenetic principle that we develop through an unfolding of our personality in predetermined stages. So like Freud, he had certain stages in certain orders that you typically confront these different challenges at very specific time frames within your life, and that our environment and surrounding culture influence how we progress through these stages. Another fun fact is that his spouse, Joan Erickson, actually completed his work after his death. And that's actually something sometimes we see in psychology and some of the other sciences, is where that we have these really smart scientists and their wife is actually doing work as well. But the woman's name was erased from the final product just because it was not seen as the woman's place. We also have the theory of behaviorism. This emerged in the early 20th century. So if we really think about things, this is not very old. I think the older that I get, the more I recognize that how fast 100 years is, and that really time can go very, very quickly. So this is, in terms of looking at the history of the world, this is really, really new stuff. And so with this theory, the keys to understanding development are observable behavior and external stimuli in the environment. All right. So behaviorism, famous behaviorists include scientists such as B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson. And there's two different types of houses for this. So there is classical conditioning, and there's also operant conditioning. We're going to go over some of these in the slides that are coming up. People tend to get these confused, so that'll be really important for you to distinguish between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So let's start with classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, was studying digestion. Okay, so he wasn't a psychologist, but what he did was help us understand how responses to one situation become attached or connected to new situations. It also explains how we develop many of our emotional responses to people or events, or our gut level reactions to certain situations. And so we'll talk about his landmark study that a lot of you probably already remember from Gen Psych. All right, so his classical conditioning experiments dealt with dogs and digestion. And so basically what he found was that he was giving dogs food, that he was pairing a bell with the food. And then one day there was a malfunction with the food and the bells went off. The food didn't happen and the dog still salivated. So if we break that down, what happened was we had this neutral stimulus, the bell, got paired up with the food, which elicited the salivating. And it happened so many times that they paired up together so that even when you remove that food piece, it still made the conditioned response happen. So before the conditioning, you have the unconditioned stimulus, that food produces an unconditioned response, the salivation. So food produces this response naturally. During the conditioning, you have this neutral stimulus, that bell that's presented just before you get the food. And that happens enough times that after the conditioning, that neutral stimulus, that bell, becomes a conditioned stimulus. So when it's presented alone, it still produces that conditioned response. So if you've ever gotten sick after you ate a certain food and then you couldn't eat that food for a really long time, your body conditioned you to think that food got you sick, even if it didn't. So this is one of the cool little graphics we had from our book. So you see in the first one, the dog salivating because of the food. And this before the conditioning occurs. And then you see that the bell doesn't do anything. During the conditioning, you see that the salivation, the food, and the bell are happening at the same time. And then after the conditioning happens, you ring that bell, you still get that slobber. So that moves us on to John B. Watson, who is not my favorite. Let's be real here. Okay. But John B. Watson, though, did establish the psychological school of behaviorism. So for that, I applaud him. There's a lot of behavioral principles that I've used in my professional work out in the real world, which has been really cool. But he's known for applying classical conditioning to human behavior. So whereas our last researcher worked with animals, John B. Watson took this and conditioned 18-month-old named Little Albert. That's what Little Albert, wink, wink, to fear a white rat. So if you've had an ethics class or another research methods class, you probably learned a lot, or have heard of this study before, where uh, he conditioned little Albert, right, who actually liked that little white rat, was one of favorite things, paired up with a really loud, frightening noise, and then eventually made little Albert fear the white rat. He's also known for this quote: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to be any specialist I might select. A doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief." So what do y'all think about this? This would be another thing to go and communicate in our perusal document, to if you want to talk with your classmates about this. You don't have to, but sometimes people miss the class interaction piece in an online class, so you're welcome to do that. I find this quote kind of interesting, because I think it has some connotations to it. Uh, can you do this, do you think? Can you train any child to become a doctor or a lawyer or a beggar man and thief? Notice it is using he pronouns and man. They're using this, I believe, to be inclusive of everyone. But during the zeitgeist, when this was published, they tended to use just he pronouns, and they could have just been speaking to males, but during the zeitgeist, it wasn't uncommon to see this. So there's also operant conditioning. This is B.F. Skinner. Sought to explain how new behaviors are learned, not just elicited. There was a really cool quote where B.F. Skinner basically said at some point there's going to be some sort of machine where people can just be reinforced to learn. And it's kind of funny because the way that the quote went made me think of online learning now, and we actually see that. So there's this type of online learning. There's also these, they're called MOOCs, and you can go to places like a website like Coursera, and they have all these free classes that you can take from Harvard or Ivy League schools, and learn whatever you want. It's not for degrees, but if you just want to learn. But a lot of times they'll have reinforcement like that. They'll have the quizzes, and you can you'll click which one you think the answer is, and it'll either punish you, tell you you're wrong, or reinforce you because you got the correct answer, and it helps you learn. So for this theory, behavior is motivated by the consequences that we receive for the behavior. And so here we're talking about reinforcement and punishment. Even though you've probably studied this before, people really get reinforcement and punishment confused quite frequently. So we'll learn about that a lot in this class. So behaviors are either strengthened or weakened because of their consequences. Okay, so for this theory, reinforcement is something that increases a desired behavior. Okay. In this theory, punishment is something that decreases an undesired behavior. The word positive means add. It doesn't mean happy. It doesn't mean good. It just means to add something. And with this theory, negative means to remove. Okay, so people get really confused about what these terms mean. But if we're going to go and define, the word positive doesn't mean happy or positive the way that we typically think. It just means to add something. Negative just means to remove. We also have social learning theory. Sometimes you'll hear this called social cognitive theory as well. Our famous theorist for this is going to be Albert Bandura, who actually just passed away in 2021. In this theory, if we're going to summarize it into about one sentence, you basically learn by watching other people. Bandura was famous for the Bobo doll experiment. So in the study, basically, and we'll actually watch footage of this later on in the semester, had these Bobo dolls. So the Bobo dolls are these clowns that if you punch them, they fall back and then they come right back up. And so in the study, basically, they had adults either playing nicely with them or beating them. And then what they found is that kids who watched the adults beat up the Bobo dolls when they were left to their own devices, they also beat up the Bobo dolls. They saw an adult model good behavior or more pleasant behavior with the Bobo doll playing nicely, then the children would do that too. They also found that there was a bigger effect if the child was the same gender of the adult that they saw in the video. And so that was really landmark for the time. And when we get later on into the semester, we'll be able to watch some of the footage from the actual study. So a really big term to remember from this theory is modeling. So for example, for my in-person class, I try to model being on time. And that means that if you've had me in person, you've probably seen me come to class on time every time. There's only been 2 times that I've ever been late. One, I got a flat tire on my way to the university, and then the other time, I just messed up. So likely, I try to model that behavior. Most of my students see that I do that because being on time is important to me. So I show them the behavior I want to see. You also hear something called self-efficacy that we'll also talk about later in the semester. And this is someone's confidence in their ability to perform a particular task. We have different sources that we can get self-efficacy from, but that will be for future us to learn more about. You can also be vicariously reinforced or punished. So for example, if someone in this class got 100% on their final exam, or let's not do final exam. Let's say we have a midterm exam, which we don't. We have 3 exams throughout the semester. But if we had a midterm exam and I gave someone $100 for getting 100% on the midterm exam, and everyone else witnessed that, they might work really, really hard to get 100% on their final, hoping that maybe they would get that as well. So here's another one of my favorite theories. We have the theory of cognitive development. Our famous theorist for this is going to be Jean Piaget. So if you struggle to say that name, it's Piaget. And so when we're looking at the theory of cognitive development, I like to point students to the word cognitive, which typically means thinking or how we think. So this is also another one of those stage theorists that go across the lifespan. Some people after Piaget continued the theory to add an additional stage, but we'll get to that. And so one author describes this as children progress through qualitatively different stages of cognitive growth. An easier way to say this is that our thinking changes across the lifespan. The way that we think about things when we're kindergartners is probably not going to be the same way we think about things when we're 35 years old. So Piaget's theory talked about having schemas and something called accommodation and assimilation. So schemas are the way that we think about things. Some places will call this a thinking script, the way that it's the pinnacle or the example we see when we think about something. So right now, wherever you are, close your eyes. And when I say this next word, get a picture in your head, and then go to our perusal document and tell me what you saw in your head. All right. All right. So here it goes. Cat. All right. Now go to the perusal document and tell me, what color cat did you see in your head? I always joke when I do this activity that I always think of Garfield as the very first cat that I see in my head. Some people see black cats or orange cats or calico cats or brown cats or white cats. Everyone typically probably doesn't have the exact same picture of a cat in their head unless they're thinking Garfield like me. So whatever you thought of first when you shut your eyes, that is your schema for what cat is. And so we have these different ways that we think about the world, that we see the world, but it's not just with the word cats. It is there with everything that we think about. And so I had a friend that was a linguistics major when I was going through graduate school. And what they said, it's amazing that we can communicate with anyone because we have a thought in our head, right? And we know exactly what we're thinking, but then it has to travel and we have to communicate what we're thinking to another human who has to listen to it, what you're saying. And then they have to take the information they're listening, and that will potentially have completely different images in their own head based off their own experiences, their own thought patterns, and things like that. So how do we ever even communicate with one another? And I think that's it's kind of interesting because that means like if everyone's thinking something different, or most people are probably not thinking the exact same thing, I would hope that we would be able to be more patient with people, because we know that it's a really hard thing to communicate well. So, according to Piaget's theory, we can assimilate new knowledge into our existing schemas or our existing thinking scripts. So, we might be like, okay, this information, we can add it to what we're thinking, but it doesn't completely eradicate what we're thinking. So, you might at first think, okay, all cats have 4 legs, and then you see a 3-legged cat running around, then you might be, "Oh, okay, cats are still cats, but they might have missing legs." With accommodation, this is when we had to change our entire schema or thinking pattern to fit new information or experiences. So, what do you think a lot of kids, when they're little, call skunks? What animal do you think kids call skunks? If you said cat, that's really common, right? And so, um, if a kid has completely changed their thinking script, they might be like, no, this is actually a brand new animal called a skunk. And they have a new category. They have to incorporate, or they have to completely change their idea of what a cat is, a 4-legged soft creature that purrs and has a tail, right? To be, okay, this is what a skunk is. This is what a cat is. And they accommodate that new information into their thinking script. So we're also going to learn about information processing theory throughout the semester. And this is basically a theory that discusses about how humans process the information that they receive. So this relates to how we understand memory, how information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. With this theory, a lot of times what we use is the metaphor of a computer. And so we'll talk about this and we'll actually learn how fragile our memories are. There's also humanism. This iteration of the materials that we've been using for lifespan is the first one to mention this, which I thought was really interesting within the context of a lifespan development class. So our main theorist for this one is going to be Carl Rogers. And this emphasizes human potential and an individual's ability to change. And so in this theory, it says that we have the real self. This is who we are in actuality. And there's also this ideal self that we want to be. And so we experience something called congruence when this real self lines up with this ideal self, and that gives a harmony to someone's life. And so humanism would say that caregivers help development by providing this unconditional positive regard. So if you've ever heard someone say they love someone unconditionally, that means they love them no matter what. It doesn't matter if they killed your dog, ran over your favorite baseball bat. I don't know. I'm making things up now, but no matter what they've done or what they'll do, you'll love them no matter what. That they don't need to do anything to get your love. Like they don't have to hug you or show up to your baseball games, since we're going with that baseball bat example. They just give this unconditional positive regard, and that allows people to become who they actually are because they're not worried about being socially desirable or trying to earn someone's positive regard. And so in this theory, there's some principles that Carl Rogers would indicate show that someone has the good life. So this would be more openness to experience. This is not the only time we'll hear this phrase. We'll actually hear this again when we start talking about personality later on. They have like an existential lifestyle. So this is living each moment fully within the moment, trusting your own judgment, having freedom of choice, high levels of creativity. The person's reliable and constructive, and having a rich, full life, experiencing joy and pain, love and heartbreak, fear and courage more intensely. We also have the hierarchy needs. And our theorist for this one's going to be Abraham Maslow. And so in here, it's also a stage theory where there's certain needs that you need to have met before you can move on into a different stage. Some people would say this is stage theory. So your physiological needs, food, shelter, uh, water, these are your basic needs, safety, being safe where you are, love and belonging. So this would be your relationships with other humans, self-esteem, and then up to self-actualization, and that we progress through these things. So once you have your basic needs met, you move on to having a safe place or feeling safe within your environment. And then after you feel safe, you can move on to finding love and so on and so on. We also have socio-cultural theory, and this is Vygotsky, who is also Russian, actually died at the height of his career. And that's really unfortunate. But this theory emphasizes the importance of culture and the interaction and the development of cognitive abilities. So this theorist is known for social constructivism, that we create meaning with others or we learn with others, and something called the zone of proximal development, which we'll talk about in depth later in the semester. Basically, with this theory, you learn through modeling from other people and the support or the scaffolding they provide. So if we're thinking about this course, I provide scaffolding to you in a number of ways, right? So you come into this class, I assign certain readings for you to do, quizzes to do, so it can help you try to encode that information into your long-term memory so that you can retrieve it later on when we need to apply it with a project that we'll be doing and the exams and things. I also provide these lectures and different videos for you to watch. And this is all so that I can help you learn and get the information that we're learning in this class somewhere that you'll be able to do this by yourself one day, or you'll be able to apply this information in your life or your jobs. And so that is one way. There's a lot of what kind of different activities have you been scaffolded before? Where some sort of learner, or they would say a master learner, someone who is more skilled, helped you get to where you need your skill level, where you need it to be for something. Hopefully you're sharing these ideas. If you don't want to go into our perusal document, you can always shout it out loud. You can talk to your roommates or whoever you want about it, but think about these examples because that is one way to remember information. So by providing your own examples, you attach meaning, and when you attach meaning, you're more likely to remember it. We also have one of my favorite theories, this is ecological systems theory, and this is Yuri Brofmanbrenner. And this theory purports that development occurs within systems. All right. The book describes this theory horribly, horrendously. There is wrong information in the book. And so I will work on getting the book updated to reflect the right information with references. And so there's a related term that we'll talk about that's not from this theory, but it relates to something called the chronosystem, which we'll go over in a minute, called zeitgeist. And all you need to remember about zeitgeist is it's the culture of the time period you're in. If we broke this word down, I don't know how many of you speak German, but Zeit means time and Geist means ghost, right? So it's time ghost, which is kind of cool. But it's talking about that every time period that we have has a spirit to it, like an essence that it's living and it's breathing. And we see that reflected in culture and books and ideologies and activities, and it's really beautiful. It's something that's really hard for people to understand until they go through a change in the zeitgeist. And so like pre-COVID was very different than after COVID, just like pre 9/11 was very different than after 9/11. Some things changed within the spirit of the times. And that's something that you all may have been able to experience by now. I know that when I was a 19-year-old, I didn't understand it. So it's really fun. So if we're going to talk about ecological systems theory in a little bit more detail, there's different parts of the ecological system. We have something called our microsystems. These are systems that we're directly involved with. So, for example, you're directly involved in this class. So I am part of your microsystem. If you had caregivers that raised you, they were part of your microsystem. If you have a job, that's part of your microsystem. If you have a place of worship, that is a microsystem. If you are in a club, microsystem. And the part where the book really struggled was this second one here called the mesosystem. And this is the interactions between our microsystems. So, for example, if with my kids, when I went to uh, back to school night, I met the teachers, right? So, that back to school night is a mesosystem in a way because it's the interaction between my kid's teacher and their parents. All right. Then we have the exosystem. This is a system that influences development that you're not directly involved with. And this is another one that our book didn't do very well. So, for example, how many of you know who the Board of Governors are? Unless you're our student Board of Governor, you probably don't interact with their Board of Governors at UCM very often, but they're really, really important people because they are the ones who determine what tuition is. They're the people who determine dorm room policies. They're the person who determine if they're laying off faculty. They're the ones who decide every single thing that influences UCM. So, for example, if the Board of Governors decided to make tuition completely free, that would very much so directly involve what you're doing, but you're not directly involved with them. So you might have more classmates then. Everyone might want to go to UCM then. Or what if they made it $100,000 a credit hour to go to UCM? That's going to affect your development too. Most likely you won't go to UCM anymore unless you love this class that much. We also have our macro systems. These are overall cultural systems or society. And so everyone who is raised here, right, in the United States might have a very different development than people who are raised in a different country. Right, because we have different cultural norms. There's things that are considered polite here that are rude other places. And there's things that are considered uh, polite in other places that are rude here, right? Because that's because development takes place within cultural systems. And so this class is really interesting because we can look at some of these things. There's some things that are kind of universal in development, but there's also different variations that are culture dependent. For example, different cultures walk later than our culture because they don't let their kids walk around because it could actually be dangerous. Or there's other countries that have certain like spiritual beliefs where that the children are very sacred and should be carried for a certain amount of time, and so they don't walk as early as Americans do either. Okay, and so if you're in the in-person class, you would probably get the opportunity to watch a documentary called Babies, and we usually do that when we're talking about infancy and toddlerhood. But when we get to that unit, remind me if you're interested. It's a documentary that follows four kids in different cultures up to basically toddlerhood, and it's great to see how culture can really influence development, particularly in the earlier years. We also have a chronosystem, the system of time. So your development is very different now than it would have been, you know, 2000 years ago, or will be in 500 years from now. Each time system or system of time has a different culture. So it has a different zeitgeist that we're talking about earlier. It also has different expectations, cultural norms, technology is huge, inventions. And so our development isn't just our own individual development, but takes place within these different systems, which also influence us as well. So here's a little picture. So it's sometimes it's hard to visualize what this theory is saying. So you see you're in the middle and you have all these microsystems, which I have here in blue. So remember, it could be your parents, it could be your spouse, it could be your friends. The things you're directly involved with are those microsystems. And then we have our mesosystems, which are the connections that we have between our microsystems. Not every microsystem is connected to another one. So that's something sometimes students will try to force that. Not all microsystems are connected, right? So, for example, the relationship between my children and my spouse is a mesosystem that influences my development. So if my kids are tormenting my spouse, that either, I might have to stop that, right? Or I might have to stand up for my spouse, or it might cause stress. So I don't know if any of you have ever had like a romantic partner that didn't get along with your caregivers from your family of origin. But if they don't like your romantic partner, that can cause some additional stress, right? They may not, or if your friends don't like your romantic partner, if you have one, that might mean you can't hang out. You might have to make different choices. and things like that. And so then we have those exosystems again. Those are things that influence your development that you're not directly involved with. So if we go back to the spouse, if you have a spouse that has a really stressful job, you're not directly involved with their work, most likely, but they may come home and be very frustrated because things that happen at work. So whatever's happening in that work environment influences you. Then we have that macro system, which deals with culture and laws and all the things of broader society. And then we have the chronos system, which is the time period again. We also have evolutionary psychology. And this is inborn biological forces that evolve to promote survival, to explain how we behave. In other words, which human psychological traits are evolved adaptation? So a really big common example of what they say would be evolutionary would be morning sickness. And that's where people who are pregnant get sick so that they don't do what? Why would this be good for survival throughout most of humanity? So we're not just thinking about our system of time now, but historically, why would morning sickness be good? If you said to stop the person who's pregnant from eating things that would hurt the baby, you're right. That's what they think. That's their theory. So evolutionary psychologists would say, hey, this is to protect the survival of the species. And so they actually have studies that show that people who are pregnant who get morning sickness are less likely to miscarry, which I thought was really, really interesting. We also have attachment theory, and there's a whole bunch of theorists that are associated with this. We have Conrad Lawrence, we have Harry Harlow, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth. And attachment is basically how we connect to caregivers and how that impacts our lives. So we'll look at this in the younger years with children. Then we'll also look at this as adults and how they attach to romantic partners. And this theory also extends across the entire lifespan. We also have behavioral genetics. And this is the use of genetic methods to investigate the nature and origin of individual differences in behaviors and studies the effects of heredity on behavior. Okay. And that's actually where we leave off for lecture this week. I am super excited to have you all here. I hope that these videos are helpful, and I will try to do as many of them as I can. Sometimes you might get just written lectures or something like that, but I am excited and hope you are too. Have a great week.